morning. I'm Moulton with the MaineDOT. I want to thank the folks today for asking me to come to the symposium and present. I think my presentation is perhaps a little different from most today. I realize this is primarily an engineering event and a lot of discussion around technology and engineering around railroads and things of that nature. And I come more from the business side and the freight movement side. So I want to talk a little bit about today what Maine has done in regards to improving its rail lines, say over the last 20 years or so, and then talk about kind of what's to come and what we've done, starting from a very low level to what we have today and what we're planning on. And I think it's important to kind of ground ourselves in some of the basics along with some of the new and innovative things. So in that regard, I just want to talk a little bit about myself first. I'm the Director of Freight and Passenger Services at MaineDOT. And what I'm talking about today primarily relates to the DOT's freight office and the work that we do there. But I'm also involved in the passenger side of rail, as well as airports and transit and ports and marine and all those types of things as well. MaineDOT established its freight office in 1996. And we work a lot directly with businesses and transportation providers to provide freight strategies and options to businesses to use. So it's about the businesses. It's not about the mode for us. We're kind of mode agnostic, but how do we provide options and competition and stuff for Maine businesses to move their products and goods? MaineDOT for a long period of time has worked very closely with its rail operators. And that's an important piece of this. It's not like highways and things of that nature where we control or own the asset. In a lot of cases, the railroad assets are owned by private entities, and we have to work very closely with them and as we're working on their infrastructure. Although there are some state-owned rail lines that are in active service that the state has purchased and then leased to private operators. So in that regard, generally, when we purchase lines, it's because they are to be abandoned or given up service on, and we're kind of the owner of last resort. So in that regard, the lines that we get aren't necessarily competing with the private sector. It's more of, if we're going to preserve rail service on these lines, the state needs to step in and buy and own them. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, but more so about working with private railroads as well. One other thing to note, and kind of a transition for Maine, is going back 20 years or so, there were no large class one railroads here in Maine. And up until June of 2020, there weren't. This is relatively new phenomena. And likewise, passenger service, the Downeaster is getting ready to celebrate its 20th anniversary in December. So those types of things, again, very important. And it's kind of a note, from where we were to where we're going, and hopefully the progress that we've made. So I'm going to start with kind of the large capital projects that we focus on and the funding sources and some of the projects we've done over the years. And so up until going back about 10 years or so ago, there weren't a lot of federal sources for rail funds, unless, again, you had some really big transformative projects, especially on the freight side. Some money for passenger, but on the freight side, it was pretty scarce. So as I talk about these, I'm gonna bring on my map. This is my only other slide. No death by PowerPoint today, but I wanted to have this for reference as we work through, talking about some of these projects. And so the first one I'm going to touch on, and very briefly, was the Downeaster project beginning in 1999 through 2001, where the rehabilitation took place between Portland and Boston, Massachusetts, of the rail lines, and a lot of that focused on rail lines in Maine and New Hampshire, and then we connect to the MBTA, and a little bit of money was spent there, but it was primarily in Maine and New Hampshire. So that first project was about $62 million and included track and some bridge work and signals and things like that, safety improvements, as well as stations and things of that nature. And so when I talk about whether it's freight or passenger, when you invest a dollar, it's kind of like a road. When you invest a dollar in a rail line, it benefits both. So as you do improvement, it could benefit a future passenger service, or if you do current improvements in regards to passenger, there are freight benefits. As you improve the infrastructure, you add speed and capacity and things of that nature. In regards to passenger, you're kind of, buying that, you're adding passenger to private infrastructure. The freight road's going to ask you, what's the benefit? What are you bringing? So some of those improvements are needed for passenger. And quite frankly, it's a little bit price of admission to run on other people's infrastructure. So those projects have those two effects. So that original project, again, was $62 million, primarily spent between Portland, Maine, and Plastow, New Hampshire, which is the state line in New Hampshire, Massachusetts. The Brunswick project for the Downeaster came along in 2012, and that was about 32 million and made improvements between Portland and Brunswick. That's the current, endpoint of the Downeaster. There's a lot of talk about extensions and ongoing studies and things of that nature. And I'll stay out of that for now because I'm going to focus on infrastructure improvements. Along with that, there's an annual capital maintenance program that the Passenger Rail Authority undertakes with the freight railroads to get these projects done, and ongoing work, adding sidings, increasing speeds, things of that nature. So that's ongoing, not just these big projects. So kind of moving now to freight infrastructure in Maine. So once you get outside of it, even in that corridor, the Downeaster corridor, tracks are in very poor condition. If you go back 20 years ago, there was a lot of 10-mile-an-hour track, FRA Class 1, some Class 2, which is 25 for freight, 30 for passengers. So large improvements, because the Downeaster runs at, some sections Class 4, which is 79. Very big difference in infrastructure and the needs and the quality of what's out there. So once you move beyond those projects, you really start to look at Maine system, and it was really had degraded over the years. There wasn't a lot of public funding sources, and the freight railroads, the traffic had degraded to such they really didn't have the funding to invest in the infrastructure. So there's kind of this slow degradation of the infrastructure throughout Maine. And so one of the first big projects we had going back to 2010, the lines up in Aroostook County, which if you look in northern Maine, you see the orange there and it says MDTT/MNR. So MDTT is Maine Department of Transportation. We own it. It's operated by a company called the Maine Northern Railway, which is a division of the Irving companies. So those lines we bought because they were being abandoned by, at that time, the Montreal Maine Atlantic. So the state purchased those lines, put them out to a solicitation for an operator, and the Maine Northern was a successful respondent to that RFP. So along with that, we wanted to put these lines in what we call state of good repair, at least a good start for them to operate on. So a lot of these lines were in really tough shape. Basically, all of it was 10, FRA Class 1, in poor condition. So at that time, we were able to get in the early, called Tiger grants, which are surface transportation grants, and we were able to get 10.6 million to do some work on these lines. And it was really basic stuff. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today, it's what I call wood, stone, and steel, right? It's wooden ties, new rail, cut track spikes, plates, and adding ballast to get the lines back up to a standard where they're operable at least a consistent rate, if not higher speeds, but a solid 10 miles an hour, a solid 25 FRA Class 2. And those are really, that from the system we were starting with, those were the goals. We were trying to put this system back together again and fix where needs were important. So we did that work. It was primarily, again, focused on ties and a lot of ballasting, cutting the brush. I mean, really basic stuff to get these lines back in a suitable, operable condition. So we did that, got operations going there. And overall, that's been pretty successful. We've continued to invest some state funds here and there on that line, and then working with our operator, the Maine Northern Railway, we brought that line back from 5,000 carloads when we bought it, which was really meager up there, but it was needed by 23 shippers, up to over 20,000 carloads today. So it's really moving in the right direction. We're really proud of the operations that the Maine Northern has put to this, and the job they've done operating it, and are working with them to get these lines back to where they're decent shape again. And I'll talk a little more about some other projects up there, but having some success, and where you have 23, 24 shippers that still use the lines, using it a lot more. And it's really important to the industry up there. Following on to that, and our success with that, we endeavored into some other projects. And again, in the Tiger program, this one was a bigger one. It was on the east-west line. You see the ones labeled CMQR, the brown on the left in middle Maine, and then the Eastern Maine Railway lines, the blue line in the west. So we're basically connecting kind of from Canada to Canada. Very important east-west line. And in that regard, there was a lot of talk about an east-west highway back then. And we're really trying to find a way for the railroad to be a contributor in east-west and help move freight across Maine and from Maine shippers into Canada. So this was another project called Maine Regional Railways, and we were successful in getting 37 million from overall project. About 20 of that was from the federal government, a little bit of state funds, and then the match provided by the operating railroads. And we really look to partner on these grants, is be a facilitator, but leverage a lot of federal money, and then a significant share by the freight operators as well. So they have skin in the game, right? We all use that term a lot, but it's really important here. so that they're buying in and committed to what we're doing and maintaining the infrastructure after that. So we're just completed construction on all that this year, finished up the project this year, and very successful. These lines went from, again, kind of 10 with some 25 up to solid 25 and some 40. That led to, on the CMQ lines, part of it, the CP coming in looking hard at these lines, Canadian Pacific Class 1 Railroad, and they bought the railroad back in December of 19, and they still operate as a CMQR, but it's really the Canadian Pacific Railway. So we now have a Class 1 back in Maine. So that was a great thing. We have a Class 1 connection down to Searsport following that project. And they've made some big investments beyond that, along with the Eastern Maine Railway. And we've really got a great system out there now and a Class 1 operator. So it's exciting. And that creates all kinds of opportunity, we feel, for Maine businesses and things of that nature. Another big piece of this is bridges. And a lot of the bridges are old, built literally 70 to 100 years ago, still in pretty good shape, but need some updating. One of the standards now in railroads is 286,000 pounds on all your bridges, being able to handle those carloads on all the bridges. The old standard was 263 or less. And so we really looked at what else can we do on the Maine Northern to get that up to a modern standard and make that railroad competitive and those shippers more competitive now. Because if you're not up to the standards that the connecting railroads have, now you're loading the cars lighter, or you're breaking down loads as they come in. It's just not efficient. So we applied for some money. It's called, the program at the time was called Fastlane. It's now called Infra, but it's a freight program and it's a federal highway program. But actually, there's a carve out for railroads and ports. They do a certain amount of smaller grants with railroad and port to take some of the pressure off the highway. So we were successful in getting about $15 million in that program. And we're matching it along with the operating railroad, the Maine Northern. It's about $7.5 million federal money, 7.5 us, to get all the bridges up on the main line, from the line you see orange from Fort Kent down to the Mill Market area, up to 286 at 25 miles an hour. So we're building the bridges. The engineers in the group will be nodding, the bridge engineers. It's not just about getting them up to weights, but at what speed can they take those weights when those cars and locomotives hit those bridges. We work to get the bridges up so that we don't have slow orders at the bridges, so the train's slowing down to handle the weight of the larger cars. That project is mostly done. We have 5 different contracts on that. 4 out of the 5 are done, and we'll wrap that up next year. And as we're doing it, we're raising the weight limits on those bridges and the speeds at which they can handle it. Being very competitive up there again with the railroad and the operations on the Maine Northern. That's an exciting project, although it was just upgrading some steel plates and old substructure and things of that nature. Again, not cutting edge stuff, but adding more steel, upgrading old steel, making sure the substructure is good, fixing where we've got some damage over the years from, washing out of the foundations and things of that nature. And then additionally, in 2018, we were able to get a grant that we're putting in service on the Pan Am down below. Now, that one hasn't kicked off yet, but due to the sale discussion with CSX, another Class 1 who is in the process of buying Pan Am Rail, he's been holding off on that one. So that'll be coming. That's a $35 million project. That'll be between Waterville and Bangor. We'll upgrade those lines. Again, a lot of basic stuff. And then an additional Pine Tree Corridor project that they've got an award under what's called a CRISI Consolidated Rail Infrastructure Program, where we'll be working with currently Pan Am and soon very likely CSX, we hope, to complete those projects. Between the two projects, they're literally $80 million in investment in these lines. Big deal. We'll get these lines up to modern standards. It's not just getting the speeds up on modern standards, replacing rail that 50, 60, 70, 100 years old, modern standards. And so that's a big deal. So those are the kind of the things we've been doing and are looking ahead. Again, not cutting edge, but very important to get this up to a level where we've got 25 and 40 miles an hour. Freight rail is competitive again for Maine businesses. Really hope as business expands and things of that nature, we offer that alternative to our businesses, and it's a great thing for Maine. We're also looking at additional work up north as time comes along on those 2 CRISI grants I was just talking about. Those are roughly 40, 50% federal money, and then the rest is being matched by the private sector. We're administering them, and that's kind of our share. We really, it's not state funds. So we're lucky to have great support in our delegation for supporting rail infrastructure, all infrastructure in Maine. And so they've been super supportive. Another piece I just want to touch on is also improving things like siding. for rail users. And we run an industrial rail access program here at the state level, and that's to improve sidings or unloading infrastructure and other things like that for businesses here. And that's a key piece of that. I mean, the railroad doesn't matter if there's no customers. The railroad's only important if it's helping Maine businesses and Maine customers and things like that. So we run this smaller program to help improve, the customer sidings and things of that nature. And that's been a program going on for 20 years. We fund $1 million to $2 million every year. Been very popular around the state. We've touched any place where there's rail, any county we've probably touched. We've touched a lot of towns and a lot of businesses, big and small, with that. And that helps them, again, keep their infrastructure up to date and allows them to continue to use rail efficiently and things of that nature. The big key to all this, and I'll always go back to this, is relationships. So it's relationships with the railroad and being able to work closely with them and the businesses and being able to, again, have meetings, put people together. How do we leverage these projects? Most of our good ideas have come from the railroads or from the businesses, and we just try to implement them. We look at them, hey, there's a need here. How do we implement and leverage some of this money to build infrastructure in Maine? And as you see from the map, kind of build out the map where it's important and do the things that we need to do to support Maine businesses. And it's always good for us to hear, businesses that, Louisiana Pacific up in New Limerick, Moulton area, northern Maine is undergoing a big $150 million expansion right now in some of their wood products. And, they'll tell you straight up, if we didn't have good rail service, we wouldn't be doing it. So, and they've been able to expand because we've kept good rail service for them, and it continues to grow. So, their parent company in Tennessee looks at this and say, hey, this is a key factor in making investments in these mills. So that's an important piece of this. So that's kind of my piece of this in the world that I live here, in the freight office. And again, I want to thank everybody for inviting me in to have this little kind of business and freight piece along with all the technical pieces today, and congratulate you folks on a great conference. And I want to thank you for having me here today and being able to present.